folks, and welcome to the Bodybuilding Dietitians podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today for what is yet again another question and answer episode. And as always, you're joined by your trio of hosts, Tiara, Jack, and Damien. Now, today we are going to be discussing all things body recomposition. Now, what is it? Is it even possible? When is it realistic? How do you measure body recomp? What are the training and nutrition implications when it comes to body recomposition? And also, if you're pursuing a body recomp phase, is there potentially an opportunity cost? We're going to dive straight into all of these different things. So I'm going to hit you up with a big overarching question, Jack. What is body recomposition?
Yeah, so there's probably many definitions, and it's probably the most frequent inquiry that we get at TBD is gain muscle, lose body fat, which is a perfectly great goal to have, and it's what we specialize in for sure, among many other things. So I would essentially define it very, very broadly as that. So gaining muscle and losing body fat at the same time. I think
We would say that would be the positive way to change your body composition.
yes, yeah, recomping in the positive sense, as opposed to decomping, which I'm not sure if that's a word.
We need to put that on a t-shirt, decomp.
Yeah, or maybe cross out the DE and put in a re instead. Yeah, not great for branding to have decomp there. But yeah, so I think often sort of defining body recomposition is important, but aligning it with expectations and like, let's say we do a consultation with someone, whether it's for our weekly coaching or just a standard consult, getting the client's definition of recomp is super important, because then you can start to address this next point which is like, how realistic is it? So is someone's version of recomp going from 60 to 80 kilos in 6 months and losing body fat at the same time? Like, that's not a realistic version of recomp, versus maybe staying the same body weight and seeing some body composition change over kind of a 6-month period. So yeah, there are different idealistic versions of recomp in people's head, but I think for the purpose of this podcast, like, really we're looking at sort of a situation where someone is either weight stable or maybe slowly decreasing in body weight. And this will sort of come and tie into like, what are the opportunity costs of recomp? Since if someone's, and I'll throw this question collectively to you two, like, if someone's losing body weight, can it still be recomp if they're gaining muscle while losing weight at the same time? I still think it can be, like, if they're able to grow muscle while losing. I think you just kind of turn up the dial on visual change by incorporating a slight deficit if they're losing weight simultaneously.
Yeah.
There's no doubt, because you're still positively changing your body composition in that sense.
Yeah, for sure. Like, if the physique is changing, and like, that's ultimately what the goal is for body recomposition. It's more about the physique being recomped, like, then if that's being adhered to with that goal in mind, then for sure that regardless, I think if weight does move down or even potentially slightly up and the body is, the physique is changing, then I think you can definitely class that as body recomposition for sure.
It certainly depends on where someone is in their training journey, because there's no doubt that if you're brand new to this, and you have a lot of muscle plasticity, right, and you're pretty fresh on the resistance training front, there is no doubt in the world that provided you've got a pretty solid training program in place, you're nourished as well, you're sleeping well at night, sleep and like stress markers, that's all controlled for, etc., right? You can absolutely build muscle mass and lose body fat simultaneously, but you are going to probably be able to like really milk that out in the earlier stages of a training career rather than the later stages.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, I think I think you hit the nail on the head, Tio, like, in terms of, when is it realistic, or like, and when should we see those, like someone coming to, to us as that goal of body recomposition, and the majority of people who are going to benefit from that are people who are within their earlier training age, for sure. Whereas people who are, been training for, 10 plus years, and they've gone through multiple different stages of, these different phases within bodybuilding, they're more than likely, it's not going to be as, you're not going to get the more amount of benefits than someone who is, within that earlier training age, for sure. That's just what the evidence does show as well, in terms of body recomposition around, people who are early within their training age, if they gain muscle much quicker than people who are at a later stage of their training as well. So yeah, I think that's setting that expectations early with clients too, like with people who come to come to us around, maybe they do have a longer training age and they're wanting to focus on more body recomposition for various different reasons. Maybe they don't want to lose or gain weight, they just want to maintain. It's kind of setting those expectations at the start and, explaining them this is what we've seen in practice, but also what the evidence shows as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably the two biggest things there are what is your initial starting point? And yes, like how long have you actually been consistently lifting weights for in the gym? And it can go either, upwards or downwards. For example, someone, they can have minimal experience lifting weights, but they might actually be starting off in a position where they have higher levels of body fat, not a huge amount of muscle mass on their frame. Then in that case, yes, they could be in a slight calorie deficit, provided they're eating enough protein, they're hitting their micronutrients, again, recovery, sleep, stress, tick, tick, tick. But in that sense, like if they consistently get into the gym a few times per week, they're following a solid training program, they're progressively, getting stronger and progressively overloading, they can be losing body fat, but then building muscle mass simultaneously. So they would be positively changing their body composition in that sense. But vice versa, someone could actually be starting off in a position where they could be almost like borderline underweight, or they just have very little body fat on them, but also they are in a position where they're pretty susceptible to actually putting on a decent amount of muscle mass. So that's in the sense of, and I've experienced this a number of times with female athletes where they're starting off from positions where they might only be like 45, 50 kilograms, but they want to feel strong and empowered in the gym. And, you actually get them eating more food. They're not in a calorie deficit in any sense. They're actually in a slight calorie surplus, but they can actually build a decent amount of muscle mass at a fairly good rate while minimizing body fat gain. So I think you can go either way. And in both of those senses, you're obviously changing someone's body weight entirely, but in both of those cases, they're minimizing the amount of body fat they have on their frame, and they are trying to maximize the amount of muscle mass.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually, I did some research on a recent study actually from 2025, and the paper was, I'll mispronounce the names, Babrova and Wallach et al. And they looked at a few different populations for Recomp. So like resistance trained males, overweight adults, female athletes. And it was a systematic review. And they basically found that sort of the resistance trained males had like a high protein diet plus resistance training, overweight adults, a moderate deficit plus resistance training plus HIIT. And then female athletes, maintenance calories plus resistance training and creatine. So the males, resistance trained males sort of gained around 1 to 1.5 kilos and lost 2 to 3 kilos of body fat. The overweight adults sort of gained about half a kilo of muscle, lost 4 to 5 kilos of body fat, which is great. And then female athletes gained a kilo of muscle and lost a kilo of body fat. So definitely sort of reinforces what we're talking about, how it's certainly achievable. And as Damien said, I think basically the more advanced you are, like the more specific you need to be around training and nutrition variables. And it almost is the same with any sort of other athletic endeavor. Like the more advanced you are, the more specific or accurate you need to be with your strategy. And I think there's a couple of points I think we can use to sum up like how realistic is it, and also the opportunity cost side of things, like before we can get into maybe the training and nutrition part. But I would say, the biggest opportunity cost of body recomp is just the time. So if someone does want to achieve their goals a little faster, then let's say that's fat loss, then it may just be better to undertake a larger deficit and to put muscle gain on hold for a little bit and just achieve the fat loss first. The thing is, that being said, like, and I'm sure you two are the same, where oftentimes someone will come to us and want to achieve body recomp, and we end up doing a larger deficit anyway, but they still gain muscle anyway as well. And that's the benefit of seeing a dietitian where like we also have expertise in training as well. Like we can optimize both of those things at the same time, which is very different from just being given a generic training program, which is not going to do too much for you alongside kind of the strategies that we have and giving exercise feedback and things of that nature. So,
or just going on a crash diet and not paying too much attention to your exercise modality, or just feeling so lethargic and drained of energy that you can't even fathom the idea of getting into the gym and trying to lift something half heavy.
Yeah. And I guess the inverse of that is like, let's say someone really wants to gain muscle and then they kind of want to recomp their way to gaining 10 kilos of muscle. It's going to be pretty slow. So, or maybe not achieve, like, I guess then we come to the point of like, if you're it's that discussion of is bulking dead, which maybe we could do a whole episode on as well, or at least part of an episode is discussing, how slow is too slow? Can you literally just, because there are people who do propose that your body will just gain weight as a result of being sort of at maintenance, as long as you're recovering the lost energy from resistance training and exercise, then you will still optimize muscle growth. And it's been something that I've been delving into myself, is like how slow is too slow for a particular rate of gain.
Really glad that we're debunking this, because I think that it was a myth in the industry for a very long time. And it probably is still hanging around a little bit in that sense, where people are under the impression that you can't build muscle mass and lose body fat, or at least minimize your gain of body fat to a degree at the same time and do it simultaneously. But again, it really just depends on, what's your starting position, where are you at, and, kind of weighing up those pros and cons. But it is certainly possible. There's no doubt about that. But, sometimes people actually be in the position where you were alluding to this at the very beginning, Jack, where it's like, all right, you might get someone come to you and they preach that they want to positively change their body composition, but they're actually not starting off in a position relative to like their height and their body weight that you would deem it like unhealthy in any sense. They're not underweight. They're not overweight. They're in a fine position. They just genuinely want a bit more muscle mass and a little bit less body fat on their frame. I think that's then where it's actually appropriate to be like, listen, we can kind of let weight do what it may. It might go down a little bit. It might go up a little bit, but we're not talking in degrees of like, we're trying to lose 10 kilograms or we're not trying to like gain 5 or 10 kilos. Let's just kind of let weight float in this like basically buffer zone for a little while we just make sure that everything else is in check in terms of consistent training. You're eating enough protein, you've got a great quality diet, and then actually tracking their body composition changes there visually through photos. You can take measurements like girth measurements, obviously tracking things like scale weight. Hell, you could get someone to a DEXA scan every 6 months if you wanted to or so. But I think that's where you could actually keep someone in the same relative weight territory. But over time, they are going to see that like, whoa, like I'm still sitting around 65 kilos, but compared to 2 or 3 months ago, like, man, I feel so much more comfortable in my clothes. I can visually see that I'm just like, dare I say, toning up. But there's always positions like that too, where it's like, we don't really need to worry too much about where we're floating with body weight, but you can still actually change the way that your body looks.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'd love to, let's discuss nutrition and then training, and then maybe we can finish off with like how to measure it, since I'm sure people are itching to get into more of those, hear more about those nitty gritty topics. So nutrition wise, like I think there are some basic fundamentals to sort of tick off, but then we can certainly be more specific as well. And I think the underlying component of nutrition comes back to that point of like, again, the more advanced you are, the more sort of dials you may need to turn up to get the most out of body recomp possible. But I think from the very simplistic standpoint, like having enough protein and having like being at maintenance or not an overly aggressive deficit, because what is going to drive body recomposition more than nutrition, believe it or not, is your training. So training will be the main stimulus for your recomping. So if you're doing like, I don't know, like 5Ks to try and recomp without any, and maybe you're doing Pilates on top of that as well, you're probably not going to experience too much body recomp depending on your training level. Maybe you'll get a little bit of recomp if you're an absolute beginner, but the more specific your resistance training is to achieve muscle gain, the more you'll achieve recomp. So I mean, some other points, I won't talk too much on these other points, but Damien, like another point that comes to mind is, again, when we're trying to get as much out of nutrition as possible to essentially drive training, because training is what is driving recomp, like pre-workout in particular comes quite important, and potentially macronutrient splits and that sort of stuff.
Pre-workouts. I'm just trying to think of a particular food that would be perfect pre-workout. That's right, crumpets. Absolutely, carbohydrates. Thanks for that, Jack. You've done that very well. But yeah, no, definitely. I think just to touch on your point as well, like in terms of training then this is something that I've tried to really drive home with clients who are focusing on body recomposition. Like training is really the number one thing that's going to be driving a lot of this in terms of recomposition in terms of muscle gain. Like we can be absolutely nailing our nutrition. We can be hitting all the protein on the hair. We could be optimizing carbohydrates in and around the training window. But if you aren't training with enough stimulus and the training program isn't there for, to build muscle, then it's just not going to happen. So I think that's a really, really important part to drive home with clients. And it's something that I drive home as much as possible in terms of optimizing the time in the gym to build muscle and training with enough intensity to be able to do that. And for sure, like if we're wanting to then optimize things in and around the training window in terms of nutrition, then ideally, like what you said before, Jack, like eating enough protein is going to be a main driver for that, but also carbohydrates and fueling ourselves in and around training for sure. And that's something that we, I guess, touched on a little bit last week in terms of the podcast. But in what that looks like, it's going to look very, very different for everyone in terms of how much grams per kilo, all this sort of thing. But ideally having around that 0.5 gram to 1 gram per kilo body weight prior to training in terms of carbohydrate load is going to be the most optimal in terms of making sure that you are having a sufficient amount of carbohydrates for your training. But then, and in terms of, you could argue then how much carbohydrates should you have in a day? Well, it's going to be very dependent. Like the first thing that I would do when working at a client who is focusing on body recomposition is firstly assessing how much protein they need during the day, then assessing the total amount of fats, which is going to be from 0.6 to 1 gram per kilo body weight, which is kind of a very ballpark figure. And then the rest of those calories coming from carbohydrates. And again, that's going to be looking very, very different for everyone, but really ensuring that a decent amount of those carbohydrates are coming in and around that training window to support training as much as possible. Because as we know, training is going to be the main driver for this in this current phase.
And of course, if you want your training to be sustainable long-term and you want to be adequately recovering from your training session so that you can consistently show up to the gym day after day, week after week, yeah, of course, sprinkling in rest days in there, but you want to make sure that your diet is nutritionally sound so that you do have a very micronutrient-rich anti-inflammatory diet so that, you're recovering, you're not always ending up sore, and that you can actually sleep well at night. You've got great digestion, you're taking care of your immune system so that you're not getting sick, and that's then throwing you out of the gym for a few days of the month, et cetera, et cetera. So the two really marry into one another. In fact, that's exactly why we created our podcast logo and then also our business logo as well, where it's like TBD and the barbell, right? And then you've got 2 plates on one side and a knife and fork on the other side, because it's like, man, these need to be in harmony. Like it's an equal balance of training and nutrition. They need to complement one another for the best results and the best, dare I say, recomp.
Yeah. I think because a few episodes ago, I can't remember which, we talked about the split of like carbs to fats. And I think for an important consideration, considering you will be at maintenance or a slight deficit, I would argue that carbohydrates will be more important than dietary fat. So I would maybe put dietary fat closer to like 1 gram per kilo body weight or under that, like anywhere from 0.5 to 1 gram per kilo body weight, just to bias carbohydrates. And especially if someone's sort of baseline maintenance calories are on the lower end, so they could potentially benefit from having a slightly higher carbohydrate intake to fuel training compared to if someone's in a surplus. And I think that's a worthwhile point to mention as well, is because if someone is at maintenance or a slight deficit, they just don't have quite the same amount of luxury compared to someone in a surplus to sort of recover glycogen or replenish glycogen and then recover in general. So as you alluded to, Tierra, I think it becomes even more important to have a quality diet and stay on top of your recovery variables, because again, that's going to feed back into getting more out of your training, which is the theme of this episode, is training sort of driving recomp. So there are probably some like sprinkles of fairy dust we could talk about with nutrition as well. Like technically, if someone had better hormone profile, then they could optimize their recomp further. So again, I think that just mainly comes back to appropriate lifestyle and optimal nutrition choices to kind of make them as healthy as possible. So, and we did a few episodes ago, we did a bit of a deep dive on sort of testosterone and sort of practices for optimizing your hormones without sort of a whole lot of supplements. So I think that'll be beneficial for other people to tune into as well. But yeah, that's definitely the major brushstrokes with nutrition. Would anything else come to your guys' mind about nutrition?
Well, yeah, I think it's really just hitting home there that if you are in a bit of a main-gaining phase, which would ideally achieve some body recomposition. So in this case, we're not talking about how you are either in a calorie deficit or a calorie surplus, and you're kind of hovering in that buffer zone of a relative territory for a body weight, and you're just at maintenance calories. Then, yeah, I think that's where it would be even more important to really place an emphasis on the fact that, okay, I'm not just hitting my macros of these 3 protein, carbs, and fats every single day, but it really is important to focus on where are those macronutrients actually coming from in terms of food sources. Because if you are at maintenance calories and you're trying to train really hard as well, of course, you're going to get that biofeedback of like, I'm hungry, right? And your body's probably actually going to always be in this state of like, yeah, I could eat if you're not in a calorie surplus, but your body's trying to actually change composition. And you have to, like, building muscle mass, it's an intensive process, right? So if you want to feel highly energetic, but you also want to feel satiated from your foods, then I think it probably is going to be a lot more ideal to focus on, okay, I want to make sure that the majority of my carbohydrates are coming from more complex whole grain sources or things like your fruits and vegetables, etc., right? Rather than maybe just having a lot of just like low fiber rice products, or making sure that your dietary fats, they are coming from, again, more satiating sources that have a lot of micronutrients in them, maybe more nuts and seeds and avocado, rather than opting for just like oil-based products, and again, Jack, love olive oil so much, but for someone could even be eating something like whole olives on their salad instead of actually drizzling on olive oil, if that's going to make them feel a little bit more satiated, etc. So yeah, I think that just, ticking off those little things, I think is super duper important to maximize your results in this sense. But what about training though? Obviously, in the sense of it's not just like go to the gym and lift weights, but having a program that is, tailored to you and your specific physique goals, but also tracking your training and making sure that you're actually progressing in the gym.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy. I can start with this one. So did you have anything else to say on nutrition, Damien?
No, I was just going to really drive home what you said here. I really like that point around, muscle building is an intense, laborious process for the body. And, you most likely will be hungry at that point because your body is telling you to eat more because it's an energy-driven process and it needs energy to make energy. So, focusing on more foods that are micronutrient dense, fiber dense, that are going to actually satiate you. So you're much less likely to then potentially overeat, and then all of a sudden you're in a calorie surplus and your weight's going up. Obviously that's not the goal for this current phase. So I really like that point you've driven home around, getting in volumizing foods as well, so you do feel satiated around that time. And most likely, if you are volumizing with fruits and veggies, you're going to be getting your micronutrients there as well, which is going to support your recovery, your training, and body recomposition goals as well.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that, if you actually look in the space of like a 12-month time span, if you're not on top of your nutrition, like your immune system can really take a hit. And more often than not, people just go through these little periods of sickness. And unfortunately, it does knock them out. It might just seem like a blip here or there. It's like, oh, I wasn't feeling my best. So like I didn't go to the gym 1 or 2 times this week. Like you add that up across 52 weeks of the year. It's like, man, you could potentially miss a hell of a lot of training sessions because you are a little bit more susceptible to getting ill. So taking care of your nutrition, as we know, like the majority of our immune cells in the human body, they are in the gut, and it's heavily influenced by, having a very healthy gut microbiome. And that is going to be influenced by the quality of your diet, how much, different variety of fiber types you have coming in there. So yeah, I think we could harp on forever, really preaching why you should eat fruits and vegetables and micronutrient rich foods. But Jack, do you have anything else to touch on nutrition, or did you want to touch on training?
One final point with nutrition would just be that, like, some people will be tempted to underfuel, and we just got to remember that fueling as best as we can. It sometimes to the brain might seem a bit counterintuitive, where if I want to get leaner through body recomp, surely I should be eating less. Which for some people, yes, that will correlate with eating less, but many people might even have to force themselves to fuel appropriately and to, at the very least, optimize their fueling sort of times and their fueling window. So getting on to training though, I think it depends again a lot where someone's starting from. And often when people come and work with us, like it does sort of create a ground up approach from training and really just sort of nailing the principles of training rather than just handing someone a program and being like, okay, do this and you'll get the results. Like just like any other sport specific sport in general, there's a skill associated with lifting, which is probably the number one thing that I try and help people out with regarding training and just of course making sure that their training program is tailored to their preferences, like where they train at what muscle groups they want to bring up. But I think just to run through some of the fundamentals, like one, training execution. So like what is the way we can get the most out of a particular style of execution in terms of muscle stimulation? So training at longer muscle lengths, like ensuring that you're getting sufficient range of motion with a movement, ensuring that it's accurate and replicable kind of week to week or session to session, so that you're not sort of just inflating your numbers week on week. And also just really leaving your ego at the door. Like I think there's a healthy amount of ego in the gym to kind of fuel you to want to progress. But when the ego means that and ego could be replaced with any other word, but when the ego starts sort of making you want to get progressions week on week when you haven't earned them, I think that becomes more of an issue, because you're just degrading movement quality, which is then degrading the stimulus that you're getting. And it's a very common question that I address almost every day. And at least one check-in is like, I'm not progressing on X movement. Like, what should we do? And like, firstly, it's important to reframe like what progression is, like whether it's a rep increase or a load increase or an improvement in execution, but also looking across a particular time frame as well. Like if you've progressed in the last 4 weeks, you have progressed. Like you don't need to progress session to session for the movement to warrant being in the program, especially if it's like a bicep curl or a lateral raise, like something which will have sort of a lower progression frequency.
Or even a big compound movement. Like, I think this is where RPE really comes into play, like your rate of perceived exertion, because you could be under a hack squat with a given amount of weight and it's freaking hard. And, that the very first time that you attempt that weight, you could like borderline that. You're like, that was like a 9 out of 10 RPE. Like that was ridiculously tough. And then on paper, the following week, it might look like you haven't progressed because maybe you lifted the same amount of weight for the same number of reps for the same number of sets. But if you reflect a little bit, you're like, all right, that was still ridiculously tough, but it's not quite as difficult as it was last week. It might have been like an 8 out of 10, etc. So even that's a form of progression.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Progression.
I mean,
comes in so many
another
different
point
shapes and sizes, progressions. Yeah. Like in terms of,
Mm.
it's not just through numbers. It's not like, sure, if we're logging training, then we can sometimes get quite numbers driven in terms of the progression. Like I need to see this number move up, or like the load's not moving up, the reps aren't moving up. But if it just feels better, if there's better, dare I say, mind muscle connection, if you're stimulating the muscle more, then that's definitely a form of progression. Like if it just feels easier, the techniques, if it's a technique change, like maybe you're not arching your back as much, or maybe you're not using as much body English or momentum, like that's still a form of progression, even if the number hasn't changed in the logbook. And that's something that I've really tried to drive home with clients who sometimes do get quite numbers focused within the logbook. Like there are many, many different forms of progression, and there's many, many different ways we can go through this rather than just seeing that number move every single week.
How you made that point, Jack, there about, harming your ego. I think in the long run, if you're concerned about your ego, it's probably going to take a lot more of a hit when you realize that, man, I should not be trying to deadlift 160 kilos for reps in the gym when like really I could probably get by with a good 120 with like pristine form and far better execution. And in the long run, that's probably going to help me build a hell of a lot more muscle mass as well. And I think that the longer that you're in this game, like you really like, I have respect for anyone who wants to live a bodybuilding lifestyle, right? But what I'm actually drawn to in the gym is that people who are so intentional with the way that they're moving, right? The execution and like lifting, a decently heavy weight. But I think it's far more impressive if you see someone on a leg press with like, sure, a number of plates there, but like just like the cadence of the reps, the range of motion and like their breathing pattern and everything. I'm like, wow, that is skill. That person has been at leg pressing for 10 years and they have mastered this, rather than someone who's on there, with double the amount of plates. You're like, whoa, that's a lot of plates, and that's going to draw your attention. But then you see them moving like half an inch up and down. It's like, dude, come on. Like you're not going to build too much of your quads there. And I think, again, the longer that you are in this game, and if you're at bodybuilding shows, etc., and you're in awe of the veterans, the people who have been doing this for decades on end. They might be in their late fees, early fees, mid 40s, early fees. And you actually ask them about their training, or you see them training in the gym. More often than not, they're not the strongest people in the gym, but the way that they're actually moving and like their sustainability and their longevity in the gym, that's why they've been able to be at this for so long. And I think that's the most admirable.
Yeah, very good points. And I think often people almost dismiss or balk at the concept of muscle stimulation and, you just need to feel it, where we're not we don't want to go too far into that camp of like, oh, it's just about how it feels and the mind muscle connection. Like we fully recognize that mechanical tension is the most important factor when it comes to muscle growth, but combining that with high accuracy of training, like high accuracy of stimulating the target muscle group. Again, let's give a leg press for an example, and you want to grow your quads as much as possible. Like anyone can put their feet super high on the leg press, load up X amount of plates per side and give, and move the weight from A to B. But that's not going to, if you want to target your glutes and get great hip flexion, then sure, that's a good way of doing a leg press. But if you want to bias your quads, then putting your feet lower down, getting full knee flexion, having calves touch your hammies, if your range of motion allows for that, and sort of getting less hip flexion compared to the other option. So even just tweaks like that, like anyone can write leg press in the program, but how you perform that leg press for your kind of particular muscle group is important. So I think that, again, coming back to body recomp, like we've kind of ticked off accuracy of execution and the importance of sort of accuracy in the training program as a sort of foundational component, but also intensity as well. And I think marrying those two things together and having like a progressive mindset, or a mindset focused on progression in the gym, is like really where the magic happens. Like tying all those three variables of knowing how to train hard enough, which we'll, I think, talk about a bit more, but being accurate, being intentional, having great execution, walking into the gym, wanting to progress and seeing the logbook increase within reason, and having a healthy relationship with that, combined with intensity. Intensity is one which it's an interesting one. And I've been in a couple of different camps myself. Like in the earlier phases of my lifting, like I would just train really, really hard and with less accuracy. And that just resulted in sort of my body being beaten up a lot and getting more niggles and injuries quite frequently. And also my central nervous system being fried. Like I used to finish a session and then just be sort of like a zombie for the rest of the day. Whereas the interesting thing is, if with the accuracy of your training, which was the prior point that we talked about, like the more accurate you are, sort of the less kind of CNS fatigue or total fatigue you'll get out of your lifts. I mean, we're not anti-fatigue by any means, but we're just about being strategic for muscle gain as a goal. Because again, using the leg press for an example, if you're truly biasing your quads on that, then as Tierra said, you're probably using less load and generating less total CNS fatigue compared to using less range of motion and etc. So often I like to see like an increase in the concentric rep speed towards the end of a set. Like that's just the most objective way to assess intensity. Because one thing with clients that I don't like doing is just being like, hey, you're not training hard enough, without any rationale behind that. I think sometimes it's not hard to take that a little personally and calling people out like that. But I will often say, hey, like towards the end of a set, often assessing your concentric rep speed is just a good way of assessing your intensity and your proximity to failure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we're talking about, concentric to eccentric rep speed in that sense, right? Like obviously the concentric phase is like the contracting phase. So for example, imagine if you are doing a bicep curl, right? When you're contracting your muscle and you're lifting that dumbbell or that cable up to and your hand up toward your shoulder, right? That's the concentric phase. And then the eccentric phase, think of it as you're extending the muscle. So in that sense, like if you're actually wanting to get closer to failure, right? Your concentric phase should probably be anywhere between like 3 to 5 seconds, right? And that's when you actually know that like, whoa, I am really, really pushing myself here. And that's a great way, either if you're in the gym yourself and you actually like are that present in the set that you can actually count like 1, 2, 3. But I'd say if anything, it's probably better to actually film yourself. And then you can actually look back on like, okay, at the very beginning of the set, how fast was that weight moving? And generally for the first number of reps in the set, like, 1 to 2 seconds, depending on the exercise, depending on the range of motion that exact muscle is actually going through. But toward the end of the set, if you know that you are actually approaching true failure, your rep should be slowing down. But if your final rep looks like your first rep, then it is the case of like, okay, you could have either definitely pushed for more reps or you are certainly capable of lifting a little bit more weight, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I love that, Jared, that point of if your first rep looks like your last rep, like, could you do more? Like, are we training at enough intensity? And that's something that I see with clients all the time. Like, I'll even bring up their video and screenshot, like, or screen record, like the first set and the last set. It's like, it's the same speed. It's like, I think we can get a little bit more out of this.
It's the exact same facial expression as well. It's
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
come on, show me some grit, man. Grit in those teeth.
For sure. And Yeah, it's the biggest point that yeah, for sure, that I drive home in terms of that speed of the movement, and looking at the first and the last rep. That's yeah, really really important one or a really easy way to see if we are training hard enough. I did want to touch on the point around we did mention around like leaving your ego at the door in the gym, but I still do think there is a healthy amount of ego within the gym when we are training with intensity or training for progressions. Like, sure, like I agree, like leaving your ego at the door is warranted when we are wanting to train with the correct amount of stimulus, the correct technique, and all that sort of thing. But you have to have a certain amount of ego to say, no, I want to progress this week, whether it's in low, whether it's within technique, or whether it's within reps. But you have to have a certain mindset of saying, I want to have some form of progression, because that's how we get better and that's how we improve. And again, if we're aiming for our goal of body recomposition and gaining muscle, that's how we build muscle, because that's where the intensity then comes from. So whilst I think, yes, it is important to not, be throwing weight around and, potentially cause an injury and just seeing the local move for the sake of seeing the local move, there is still that component of wanting to, have a healthy amount of ego to see the local move in the right way at the right time, with all those different variables that we kind of chatted about.
I think that's an excellent point. Not being hesitant to maybe make a few reps look, I don't know if you should say sloppy, but, like if you were to film it, it's the case of like, okay, your final rep compared to your first rep, maybe the positioning of your body is not like textbook, whatever that means these days anyway. But I think an example there would be, let's say that you're doing barbell RDLs, right? And you normally do 3 sets of like 6 to 8 with a given amount of weight. And, you've been lifting, I don't know, 100 kilos for the past few weeks, and you've gotten yourself up to that position where you are at 3 sets of 8 for 100 kilos, and you film your reps and they're like, yeah, your back's not bending a hell of a lot, especially toward those final few reps. It's pretty damn good form. But you're like, I really want to start lifting more weight, right? So you might progress one session up to 2.5 or 105 kilos. And again, you film yourself, and let's say that you're trying to aim for 6 reps during that very first set. Like the first 4 or 5, like they're pretty darn good, but you want to push for that 6th rep. I think that within reason, you can't, be too hesitant to have your form just break down and degrade a little bit, right? Like during that final rep or two, when you're really trying to heave up that weight, you might see a little bit of lower back rounding because you actually might be fatiguing to a degree. But that doesn't mean that you haven't earned the right to lift that weight. But it's the case of then the very next week when you come back and you reattempt it, once again, that's where you actually might progress in terms of execution, in terms of mind-muscle connection, lowering that rate of perceived exertion. You might be able to actually push out an additional rep, etc. You have to focus on these little things. But I like that, Damien, how it's like, don't be hesitant to go in there and demand more from yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's that athlete mindset, isn't it? Like if we're wanting to have that, to improve every week, and as bodybuilders, we really do. We want to see those progressions over time. Like you have to have a mindset of, sure, like I'm gonna give this everything in terms of focusing on technique, focusing on execution. I don't want to get injured, but I'm not going to let this weight drop. Like I'm going to get this rep for as much as I can. I'm going to give it my all, and I want to see that improvement. And it's definitely something that I've tried to play around with coming out of prep, like just focusing on having a healthy amount of ego, I guess, and ensuring that it's it's the technique's done properly, but also training with enough intensity to be able to gain muscle.
Yeah, but of course, within reason, and you want to earn those progressions and not take enormous jumps. Like, let's say that you've been doing some barbell bench press lately, and like you're able to do like sets of 6 to 8 with 120 kilos. Again, we're talking about someone with a pretty damn strong chest and triceps and shoulders here. But it's not like, the next week that you go into the gym, you're like, I'm going to go for 140. Slow down. Maybe 122.5. You don't want to rip a pec or, again, like, have an enormous bruise on your sternum. So, yeah, again, earn those progressions, but don't be scared to push yourself.
Use the small plates. Use the 1.2s. Use 2 plates. I think they're the only plates I've even got. I just carry around those plates and just use them. That's all I've got.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely other aspects of training, of course, but I think honestly what we've discussed is the areas where we see the deficits most frequently. Like, there's such a broad range of training volume. There's such a broad range of exercise selection where obviously there's maybe an optimal way of doing things for someone versus a less so optimal, but that's all addressed sort of in program design. Whereas what we've talked about isn't necessarily addressed as much in program design. And probably the only point that I'd touch on additionally is just rest times. Like, it just comes back to performance oriented, and the greater your performance and the greater your accuracy, the more stimulus or more muscle you'll gain out of that training program or training session. So just, I guess, reflect on that internally and be like, hey, if I rest longer, am I going to achieve a better performance and better accuracy? Because my heart rate will be lower, my respiratory rate will be lower, I'll be more composed, or will kind of having a 30-second rest time on the hack squat, will that aid me more in my goals? Like, will I be able to perform better doing that? So there's, of course, a middle ground where like you, and research has shown this as well, where like there's diminishing returns associated with a longer rest time. Like if you rest, like, I can't quote the specific numbers, but like the difference between resting 1 minute versus 2 minutes is quite significant in terms of performance benefit, whereas 5 minutes versus 6 minutes, there's not too much difference there in terms of performance gain. So, I mean, the cutoff point I usually reference is around 2 minutes, but longer, of course, like even longer for bigger compound movements. And it really will be, you don't want to be hamstrung by your lack of rest time, essentially.
Yeah. And in what position, guys, do you think it might be inappropriate for someone to pursue like body composition gains?
I think if you have a very distinct goal of one or the other, like if you have a very distinct goal of, I want to gain muscle at the quickest way possible, or I want to lose body fat the quickest way possible, then body recomposition, that sort of phase, may not be for you, because there are very direct approaches we have for both of those phases. Like if you're wanting to, if the sole goal is to gain muscle and you're not really having, I guess there's not much of a, for lack of a better word, like care for body weight gain, then going through a calorie surplus is probably going to be the ideal phase for you. And I guess the opposite for that is if you are really married to gaining muscle, but wanting just to see changes in body, reductions in body fat, then going through a specific calorie deficit phase would be for you. So, whereas if it's, you're kind of in between camps and it's like, oh, I want to do a bit of both, then that's where I would drive something towards that more body recomposition phase.
I think for me, like I definitely agree with Damien. That's the main part. But also if someone's goals or their understanding of body recomposition is just completely warped and like they're not going to achieve their goal doing body recomp, which kind of ties in with what Damien said anyway.
I think also just being realistic with someone too, in terms of like where they are at the phase in their journey. For example, some people can get very married to a body weight or a certain body composition. So for example, a competitor post show where we know that we've pushed them down deliberately to a position where they have very, very, very little levels of body fat on their frame. And hopefully they still have a decent amount of muscle mass. But in that case, like it's not going to be necessarily realistic to, try to keep maintaining around this certain body weight territory and like slowly but surely just building muscle mass. It's like, no, for the sake of your health, like it actually is important that we do get a little bit more body fat deliberately onto your frame. So we can't take this too slow. We can't keep you around a maintenance level of calories and just slowly but surely try to hope for dear God that you get a little bit more energy into your system. And when you're back in the gym, you can continuously train harder. Like in that case, like it's not like you're decomping in any sense. And you actually are like in the long run still positively changing your body composition. But that's certainly a position there where I'm like, yeah, we don't want to be hanging around in this body weight territory.
Yeah, agreed.
And then finally, like, what are some ways that we can actually measure body recomposition, guys? So people can actually like have that green tick to be like, woo, I did it. Positively actually changed my body composition.
Yeah, so there are some objective and subjective measures. Like often I will fall more to subjective measures rather than objective, but progress photos, just ensuring that they're replicable, that depending on the client, like I enjoy using a mixture of both flexed and relaxed, but I usually bias flexed where I can, just because I think it displays muscle gain and fat loss a bit more prominently. And yeah, we can talk at another time about all the nuanced aspects of taking progress photos and ensuring they're consistent, the lighting. But I guess you could do girth measurements as well. So waist, different limbs like arms, legs, hips, etc., to assess fat loss and muscle gain there. Because if your weight's staying the same or decreasing, but your arm or leg measurement is going up, then it's a kind of a safe assumption that you're gaining muscle and your waist is going down. And then more objective methods like in-body scans, DEXA scans, all of them have a list of disclaimers attached to them from us, particularly something like an in-body scan. But I think the important aspect with both of those is more so just the trend line and not getting them done too rapidly or too consistently. Like I think for a DEXA scan, like I would say every 3 to 6 months. And then like
even skin folds, maybe having your skin folds done like every 1 to 2 months as well.
Yeah, definitely. As again comes, I think we'd use the same disclaiming points of like not too frequently having the same tester, just getting as much accuracy in that test as possible, since like the susceptibility for error for certain methods are quite high, like particularly in like an in-body scan or DEXA if you've had something to eat or drink, but I think at least with body recomposition, like you can at least somewhat assume that like they're going to be fairly stable in terms of glycogen or hydration status. Whereas like a bodybuilder at peak off season versus like the depths of comp prep, there's such a huge variation there in body weight and hydration status and glycogen that it does impact those results quite substantially.
I think for the individual, the top two to know within thyself are like the way that you actually just see yourself, right? We all see ourselves every single day, whether it's under like half natty lighting in the gym when we're doing some lateral raises, or whether it's when we're taking a shower, right? It's like, okay, like I can see day to day, week to week, like this is starting to look a little bit different and I like it, right? Actually building that level of self-confidence to be like, whoa, all of my hard work, it truly is paying off. I think that you should be able to see subtle changes in your own body over time. And then the other thing is too, is just the way that your clothes fit. Right? I don't think too many people in this, maybe they're shopaholics, are constantly changing their wardrobes. And if you are changing your body composition and you're paying attention, you're like, you put on a pair of pants, so you're like, whoa, all right, like these are a little bit more loose around the waist. Or you put on a shirt, right? You're like, man, this is kind of like a little bit more snug on my shoulders. Like maybe my delts are growing. So I think it comes down to the case of like, how do you actually see yourself and how are you feeling in your clothes? Those are two great indicators of, is your body composition changing?
I would even use the logbook as a measure of, have we built muscle? Like if our lifts are going up over a certain amount, it's like if you're lifting at the start of the program, you were bench pressing, dumbbell pressing 20 kilos, and now you're up to the 35s, like that's an indication that we have built muscle in that time. So like even using the logbook to assess, if we've built muscle or not is a great tool. So, and that again comes back to what we were talking about before. But yeah, I think, and using that in combination with all the other measurements around progress photos, potentially if you wanted to use DEXA scans or skin fold measurements, all those sorts of things. I think using multiple different modalities to assess the overall, if we made change or not, rather than just using one particular metric is probably the best form.
Excellent. All right. Well, that's a pretty deep dive on positively changing body recomposition, guys. And yes, we ain't into decomp over here on TBD. So if you would like to obviously get in touch with any of us as coaches and, hit us up if you do want to positively change your body recomposition, 100%, just Google the Bodybuilding Dietitians or go to the show notes below. To wrap up today's podcast, we're going to finish with one final question, and that's something that we learned this week. So I'm curious, Damien, what did you learn this week?
Well, I'd actually learned, it was actually just this morning, I was scrolling through the gram a little bit and found a study that I didn't actually know was a thing. Maybe I did and I've just forgotten, but have you guys heard of an umbrella review before? Like a sort of study. So a systematic review is using assess multiple different studies to come back, an end result, whereas a meta-analysis looks at the actual results or the numbers associated with the studies. But an umbrella review is, a combination between a systematic review and a meta-analysis, where it uses also results and from the studies, plus the outcomes of the studies as well, to basically make the gold standard, of the two, which I didn't actually know about. So yeah, that was something that I'd learned today.
They need a catchier name than umbrella, though. I mean, meta-analysis and systematic sound much catchier. It's probably why I don't remember it.
No, I agree. It's not as sexy, that's for sure. But I guess statistics probably isn't a sexy thing. Done. You heard it here first on TBD.
And Jack, yourself, what did you learn this week?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of going to Damien's family's place on the weekend and had a deep dive in learning how to make home-cooked pizza, which was great. So I've got a pizza oven myself, which haven't used yet. So time to get that in action using the newfound skill.
Did you guys make your own dough and everything?
Well, I didn't make the dough, but I got a lesson in how it was done. So yeah, I got the easy route. So
wait, Damien, your family, did you guys make the dough?
My dad specifically makes the dough. Yeah, it gets all the ingredients all from scratch. Makes it. Yeah, he does a phenomenal job. I will say. Yeah, he does it. It was very, very tasty, and the standards have been set for pizza. He's got his own pizza oven, like the proper pizza ovens that you see in the backyard, with using all the firewood and stuff. It's a very lengthy process, but it's very, very well worth it. That's for sure.
That is so cool. In my head, I'm literally envisioning your dad, putting an elbow in this dough and then rolling it out. Did he do the whole, brush it with a little bit of wholemeal flour, but then flip it up in the air and stuff?
We're not flipping pizzas, but he definitely gets the dough out and it's rolled perfectly. That's for sure.
That's why I always imagine like pizza makers. Yeah, they're just having fun with it. They're just tossing these pizzas just around in the air.
What about you, Tia?
It's an art. This past week, I've actually been in the process of renewing my Canadian passport because, yes, I am indeed a Canadian. I was born on Vancouver Island and I was born and raised in Canada before moving to the land down under. But right now, I'm in the process of renewing my Canadian passport. And, when you're renewing passports, it's one of those things that fortunately you only have to do like every decade, so every 10 years. But man, it's a heck of a lot of paperwork and you've just got to collect so many different documents and, to identify yourself, etc. There's a lot of signatures involved. And I'm 28 years old now, but it's just one of those things that you reflect back on. You're like, man, when I was growing up and I was a kid, like, did I just take it for granted that my parents like did these things for me?
Yeah.
You just have to think back to like, yeah, when you were younger and it was just a given that your parents were going to do all the paperwork for you and all the filing and the mailing and all that sort of jazz. But I'm like, no, I'm an adult now. I can do it myself. But yeah, boy, it's a lot of conjuring up a lot of different bits and bobs. But you for renewing a Canadian passport.
Good fun.
It will be fun. Go back to Canada snow kiting next year. Very, very keen. But yeah, I think that's everything for today's podcast, guys. I hope that everyone enjoyed it. And once again, if you would like to hit us up for coaching or questions or anything of that nature, you can Google the Bodybuilding Dietitians. You can look us up on Instagram. All of that is in the show notes below. But until our next podcast episode, we hope you have a wonderful week ahead.